Mira Calloway was one of those side characters. I was Lady Calloway's timid niece, present at exactly 3 scenes, mentioned twice, and killed off page during the 3rd act by the villain's dramatic collateral damage. I had 3 lines of dialogue, all of which were variations of "Yes, my lady." Poetic? No. Fair? Absolutely not. But then, while frantically chasing my childhood crush down the hall of my university at the age of 24, tripping over my own shoelaces, and face-planting directly into a wall, I awakened. I remembered everything. Every page. Every chapter. Every horrifying footnote of the novel I had apparently been transmigrated into. Simple. Completely, utterly simple. It was not simple. They say love is unpredictable, and today's story proves it. Welcome to Romance Crave Stories, where every episode is full of passion, secrets, and emotional twists. Let's begin. The day I awakened, I was running. This is relevant context. I am not, by nature, a runner. I am a person who owns exactly 1 pair of athletic shoes, and uses them exclusively to walk to the bakery on weekends. My idea of physical exertion is carrying my own groceries, and even then I take the elevator. But on the morning of my 24th birthday, I was running down the 4th-floor hallway of Westfield University's Humanities building because Callum Hesse, my crush of 3 years, possessor of excellent cheekbones and a devastating smile, had just waved at me from the far end of the corridor, and my brain had made the catastrophically optimistic decision that this was the moment. Reader, it was not the moment. What it was, in fact, was a Tuesday. The floor was freshly mopped. My shoelaces had been loosely tied since 8 in the morning, and the wall at the end of the corridor was, it turned out, not a door. I remember the impact. I remember the stars. I remember the very specific, humiliating sound of my own forehead meeting drywall at a pace that should, by rights, have knocked me unconscious. And then I remembered everything else. It came back in a rush, not like a dream you try to grasp, but like a book falling open. Pages and pages of a novel I had read 17 times in my previous life. A fantasy romance called Crimson Throne, with its sweeping prose and its dramatic politics and its cast of thousands, most of whom existed purely to be tragically inconvenienced. Including me. I was Mira Calloway, niece to Lady Elara Calloway of the Southern Reaches. Footnote character. 3 scenes. 2 mentions. 1 off-page death. I sat up from the floor. Several students stepped around me with the practiced indifference of people who have seen too many breakdowns during final season. And I pressed my hands to my face and I thought, with great clarity, oh no. The year, as best I could calculate, was the 7th year of King Aldric's reign. I was 24 years old. The protagonist of the original novel, a charming young lord named Caspian Wren, was currently 19, and had not yet done anything of note. The villain, Lord Felix Ashcroft, age 7, was currently in his family's estate in the Northern Reaches, probably doing something awful to someone's flower beds. His brother, Lord Edmund Ashcroft, age 28, was, according to my scattered memories, currently in the capital attending some parliamentary function. I pressed my hand harder against my forehead. There was a significant lump forming. Callum Hesse was gone. Presumably fled from the spectacle of a woman enthusiastically assaulting a wall. Good. I didn't have time for crushes anymore. I had to get to the capital. I had to meet Edmund Ashcroft. I had to make him fall in love with me before the plot started moving, marry him before Felix's machinations accelerated, and then, most critically, I had to fix a 7-year-old. All of this, I decided, while sitting on a recently mopped university floor with a goose egg on my forehead, and my entire previous life evaporating behind me like morning fog. The plan, I told myself, was completely reasonable. It took approximately 3 days to remember that in the world of Crimson Throne, I was not a university student with student loans and a coffee habit. I was Lady Mira Calloway, minor nobility, resident of my aunt's household, and entirely subject to the social rules of a highly structured aristocratic society in which young women did not simply decide to go to the capital and introduce themselves to eligible lords. It took a further 2 days to come up with a workaround. My aunt, Lady Elara Calloway, was attending the capital's spring social season. She had, in the novel, brought Mira along as a companion. This was, in fact, the scene where original Mira had her 3 lines of dialogue, which meant that I was already scheduled to go. I just had to survive long enough to get there without accidentally altering the timeline so severely that the novel's early chapters collapsed. The carriage ride took 4 days. I spent most of it planning. I had 17 chapters of source material, a supporting cast I could predict with reasonable accuracy, and the significant advantage of knowing what everyone wanted before they opened their mouths. What I did not have was any idea how to make Edmund Ashcroft fall in love with me. He was kind. He was thoughtful. He cared about his people with an earnestness that the novel had described in exactly 2 paragraphs before moving on to more dramatic events. He had a horse named something like Bramble or Thistle. I couldn't remember exactly, and he apparently read history books for fun. I, meanwhile, was a woman who had spent the last 6 years studying comparative literature in a world that no longer existed, and whose most impressive social skill was remembering the plots of romance novels. Which was, I realized somewhere around the 3rd day of carriage travel, not entirely useless. The spring social season began on a Thursday. I wore a pale yellow dress that my aunt selected, and I spent the entire morning reviewing what I remembered about Edmund Ashcroft's appearance, personality, and approximate schedule. He was tall, dark hair, gray eyes. The novel had described him as looking like someone had sculpted a responsible person. He did not often attend social events, too busy managing his estate, serving in parliamentary committees, generally being the sort of quietly competent person that no one writes songs about, because he was never sufficiently dramatic. He would be at the Carrington Ball on Friday, however, because in Chapter 3 of the original novel, he was there when the protagonist first encountered his little brother Felix, who had snuck in uninvited and knocked an entire table of glassware onto a diplomat. I needed to be there first. I needed, specifically, to accidentally spill wine on him. This was my plan. I had thought about it for 4 days in a carriage, and it was the best I had. You work with what you've got. The Carrington Ball was magnificent, and I paid almost no attention to any of it, because I was too busy positioning myself near the refreshment table and tracking the entrance for Edmund Ashcroft. He arrived at 8:30. The novel had described him accurately. He was tall. He had the kind of face that looked quietly thoughtful in the way that suggested he was always solving something. He was wearing dark blue, which was an excellent color choice, and he was already scanning the room with the expression of a man who had come for one specific obligation, and was prepared to leave the moment it was complete. I picked up a glass of wine. I began moving. What happened next was technically not my fault, because what happened next was that Felix Ashcroft, 7 years old, apparently having snuck in from a side entrance 2 scenes early, ran directly into my legs at full sprint and sent both of us, and the wine, sideways into his brother. The wine hit Edmund Ashcroft squarely across the front of his jacket. We stared at each other. "I am so terribly sorry," I said, which was true, though not about the wine. Edmund Ashcroft looked down at his ruined jacket, then at me, then slowly at the small catastrophe that was his younger brother, now attempting to be invisible behind my skirt. "Felix," he said in the voice of a man who had been dealing with this for 7 years. Felix said nothing. Felix was apparently trying to become structurally part of the floor. Edmund looked back at me. He had gray eyes as promised. Something in his expression shifted. From the mild exasperation of a man ambushed by his own brother to something quieter. "I apologize on his behalf," he said. "He does this." "I've gathered," I said. "Are you all right?" He looked surprised, which told me a great deal about how often people at these events asked Edmund Ashcroft if he was all right. "I'm fine," he said. "It's only a jacket." Felix, from behind my skirt, made a very small and probably not entirely sincere sound of remorse. "It's a very nice jacket," I said. Edmund Ashcroft almost smiled. It was, I noted, an excellent almost smile. "I don't believe we've met," he said. "Mira Calloway," I said. "Lady Alara's niece." I extended my hand with more confidence than I felt. "And you are Lord Edmund Ashcroft, which means this small disaster is your brother Felix, who is approximately 7 and apparently does not read invitations." Edmund did smile then. Fully. It rearranged his whole face. Behind me, Felix tugged on my skirt. "Are you going to tell on me?" he whispered. I looked down at the future villain of Crimson Throne. 7 years old, dark-haired, gray-eyed like his brother, with an expression that was already practicing the particular brand of aristocratic disdain that he would apparently perfect over the next 15 years. "Absolutely not," I told him. "But you owe me a dance." Felix stared at me. "I don't dance," he said. "You will," I said, "once you learn." I looked up at Edmund. "And I believe your brother owes me an introduction in exchange for the wine, which was really not entirely my fault. Edmund Ashcroft laughed. Genuinely. The kind of laugh that suggested it didn't happen often enough. This, I thought, was an excellent start. The fact that Felix then accidentally knocked over the table of glassware anyway, an event that I had completely failed to prevent despite technically being present for the entire setup, was perhaps less excellent. But we couldn't have everything. The plan I revised was to marry Edmund Ashcroft, reform Felix into something resembling a functional human being, and accept that some events were simply going to happen regardless of my best intentions. That, I told myself, was completely manageable. It was definitely not manageable. But I was already in it now, standing in the wreckage of a diplomatic glassware disaster, next to the man I intended to marry and the 7-year-old I intended to reform, with wine on my sleeve and a smile on my face. The story, as they say, had begun. Chapter 1. The morning after the Carrington ball, I woke up with two things: a plan, and the dawning realization that Felix Ashcroft was already a problem. Not in the future villain sense. Not yet. In the immediate sense that he had, apparently, decided I was interesting. My aunt informed me over breakfast that Lord Edmund Ashcroft had sent a note of apology, handwritten, which my aunt found extremely significant, along with a replacement for the wine-stained gloves I hadn't even realized I'd been wearing. She held the note with the careful reverence of someone who had spotted a rare bird. "He sent gloves," she said meaningfully. "He's very polite," I said. "Mira." She set the note down. "He sent gloves. Edmund Ashcroft, who has declined every introduction arranged for him in the last 4 seasons, sent you gloves and a handwritten note the morning after meeting you." I ate my toast. I was trying very hard not to smile. "It was a difficult evening," I said. "I think he felt guilty about the jacket." "It was his brother who caused the jacket. Felix is 7. My aunt looked at me steadily. She was a sharp woman. She had been described in the novel as a sharp woman, which I suspected was an understatement. "His brother," she said, "came to speak to you before he left last night. I saw it. He didn't leave when the glassware broke. He stayed to help manage the situation, and then he found you specifically to apologize again." This was in fact true. I had managed not to make it seem significant at the time. I had managed to be pleasantly surprised and professionally gracious, and entirely unrevealing of the fact that I had come to this ball with the specific intention of spilling something on him. "He's a considerate person," I said. My aunt smiled. It was the smile of someone who has decided something. I ate my toast faster. The note, which I read 3 times after breakfast in the privacy of my room, was indeed handwritten, in the neat, slightly formal script of someone who had been taught penmanship by a strict tutor. It apologized. It thanked me for my grace in a difficult situation. It mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that his brother had apparently told everyone who would listen that a lady had defended him from being scolded, and had also promised him a dance, and that Felix had been uncharacteristically thoughtful about this for the rest of the evening. He signed it, Edmund Ashcroft, without his title, which my aunt would have found very significant if I'd shown her. I folded it and put it in the drawer next to my hairbrush. Then I wrote back. My note was 3 sentences. I thanked him for the gloves. I mentioned that the evening had been unexpectedly enjoyable despite its chaotic start, and I noted as a postscript that I had heard his brother was interested in history, and that if Lord Ashcroft ever needed a recommendation for a young reader, I was happy to offer one, as I had spent the last several years studying literature, and had strong opinions about which books were actually worth a child's time. I sent it before I could second-guess myself. It occurred to me about 10 minutes later that I had just positioned myself as someone who was useful to Edmund Ashcroft by being useful to Felix, which was extremely strategic and also completely true, because I genuinely did have opinions about children's literature, and also I needed to get close to the 7-year-old future villain before the plot gave him reasons to start scheming. 2 birds, 1 stone. The reply came that afternoon. Edmund Ashcroft was in the capital for 3 more weeks. His brother was with him, having made himself impossible to leave behind. He would be grateful for any recommendations. And, almost as an afterthought, would Lady Mira care to join them for a walk in the Westgate Gardens on Saturday, as Felix had apparently requested her specifically, using the phrase "the lady who didn't yell at me," which Edmund found both specific and accurate. I set the note down. I looked at the ceiling. Felix Ashcroft, future villain, age 7, had just inadvertently arranged our first outing. I was being outmaneuvered by a small child. This, I told the ceiling, is going to be a very long story. Chapter 2. Saturday was, climatically speaking, perfect. Warm enough for thin gloves, cool enough for the pale green walking coat my aunt selected with the focused energy of someone staging a military campaign. She adjusted my hair twice and told me not to talk too much, which was advice I intended to ignore. Edmund Ashcroft was waiting at the garden gate with Felix, who was wearing his best jacket under significant protest, and had apparently been arguing about the necessity of hats for the entire walk from their residence. The argument had apparently ended in a stalemate, because Felix was wearing the hat, but wearing it slightly sideways in a way that suggested it was a concession made under duress. "Lady Calloway," Edmund said, and offered a bow that was formal without being stiff. "Lord Ashcroft," I said. "Felix." Felix looked at me. He had the assessing gaze of a child who is deciding whether an adult is worth talking to. It was, I noted, an early version of the expression the novel had described as his calculating look. Currently on a 7-year-old in a grudging hat, it was mostly just intense. "You came," he said. I said I would. "Adults don't always do what they say." "That's true," I said. "But I try to." Felix considered this. Then he turned and walked into the garden with the decisive energy of someone who has assessed a situation and found it acceptable. Edmund watched him go with the expression of a man who has learned that following is sometimes the only option. We followed. The gardens were beautiful, stone paths and late spring flowers and the kind of artfully arranged wildness that costs a great deal of money to maintain. Felix walked slightly ahead of us, examining things with intense focus. A beetle, a fountain, a swan that he observed with deep suspicion from a safe distance. "Thank you for coming," Edmund said quietly, after we'd walked a few minutes. "I'm glad to," I said, which was true. "Your brother is interesting." "He is," Edmund said, with a weight to it that suggested interesting was sometimes a diplomatic word. "He's very clever," I said. "He's been watching that swan for 3 minutes and he hasn't moved. That's unusual for a child his age." Edmund looked at me sideways. "You know a lot about children?" "I know a lot about watching people," I said, which was accurate in ways I couldn't explain. "He's curious. He's testing things. He just doesn't always get feedback that tells him which direction to direct that energy." Edmund was quiet for a moment. "He gets feedback," he said carefully. "Our father is exacting." I filed that away. In the novel, the elder Lord Ashcroft had been cold, demanding, dismissive, the kind of father who treated children as future investments rather than actual people. The novel had not examined this in detail because the novel hadn't cared about Felix as a person. But it was, I suspected, where the damage had started. "The book I'd recommend," I said, redirecting before the silence became heavy, "is Fletcher's Natural Histories. Volume 1. It's written for younger readers, but it's genuinely interesting. He treats the subject as though the reader is intelligent, which children always notice." Edmund looked at me with something shifting in his expression. "That's specific." "Felix has been examining that beetle for 6 minutes and he hasn't touched it," I said. "He's observing. He's interested in how things work. He'd like a book that respects that." There was a longer pause. "I'll find a copy," Edmund said. "I have one," I said. "I brought it. In case." Edmund stopped walking. I stopped walking. "You brought it," he said. "In case." "I wasn't certain he'd be interested," I said, with more composure than I felt. "But I thought it was worth having." Edmund Ashcroft looked at me for a long moment with an expression I couldn't fully parse. Something between surprised and careful. Like someone who had reached for a familiar wall and found it had moved. Then Felix appeared from around a hedge, hat now fully sideways, to announce that there was a duck attempting to steal someone's bread near the eastern fountain, and we needed to come immediately. The duck incident, as it became known, lasted 20 minutes, involved all 3 of us, and ended with Felix laughing so hard he had to sit down on a bench and Edmund Ashcroft doing something that was definitely a smile. A real one, with his whole face, not the polite almost version, while trying to reason with a waterfowl. It was, by any measure, an excellent morning. I walked home with my aunt convinced that I had done no scheming whatsoever. She did not need to know about the book. Chapter 3. The tutor crisis began on a Wednesday and became my problem by Thursday. which was faster than I'd expected, even accounting for the fact that I had been anticipating it. In the novel, there was a passing reference to the Ashcroft household burning through 3 tutors in one season. At the time I'd read it, I'd assumed this was a character note. Young Felix was difficult. Young Felix was brilliant but ungovernable. I had not considered that I might be present for it. The note from Edmund arrived at noon. It was longer than his usual notes. He had a somewhat terse epistolary style that I'd come to appreciate, all substance and no decoration. And it began with the words, "Felix has explained that he does not need a tutor because he is, quote, already smarter than Mr. Holt." I read this and set down my tea. He is, Edmund continued, with a brevity that contained multitudes, possibly correct. Mr. Holt resigned this morning. This is the second resignation in 4 weeks. I am running out of people willing to be told that their educational philosophy is philosophically unsound by a 7-year-old. I have, he wrote, no rational reason to ask you this, and I am aware that it is an imposition. But Felix has mentioned you 4 times since Saturday, which is 4 more times than he mentions most adults. If you have any suggestions, I would be grateful. I read the letter twice. Then I sat with it for a few minutes, thinking about what I actually knew about Felix Ashcroft, not the villain but the child. He was clever. He was observant. He had been raised by a cold, exacting father who treated intelligence as a performance metric rather than a gift. He had an older brother who loved him but was also busy and probably uncertain how to manage someone so much sharper than the adults around him seemed prepared for. The tutors, I suspected, were not failing because Felix was ungovernable. They were failing because Felix had already identified that they were performing authority rather than actually knowing more than him. And 7-year-olds have 0 patience for that particular fraud. I wrote back, "Don't replace the tutor yet. Can I visit on Friday?" He replied within the hour, "Yes. What are you planning?" "Honestly," I wrote back, "I'm not certain. But I have a theory." My theory was this. Felix didn't need a tutor who knew more than him. He needed a tutor who was honest about what they knew and what they didn't, who treated his intelligence as real rather than inconvenient, and who made learning feel like discovery rather than performance. What he probably actually needed was a friend who read interesting things, and was willing to be wrong in front of him. I could work with that. Friday arrived. I wore my sensible blue dress, the one that said, "I am competent and not here to impress you," and went to the Ashcroft townhouse with 3 books and a genuine plan. Felix was in the library when Edmund brought me up. He was sitting in a chair that was too large for him with a book open in his lap, and the expression of someone who has been told to wait here, and is waiting here under protest. "Lady Calloway is here," Edmund said. Felix looked up. His gaze went to the books under my arm. "What are those?" "Books," I said. "Obviously. Can I sit?" He gestured to the chair across from him with the magnanimity of a small emperor. "I set the books on the table between us. Edmund took up a position by the window that I recognized as trying to be unobtrusive while actually being very attentive. "I heard you told your tutor his educational philosophy was philosophically unsound," I said. Felix's chin came up slightly. "It was." "In what way?" He stared at me. Adults don't usually ask that. "I muskin." There was a pause. Then Felix put his book down. He kept saying things were true because they'd always been done that way. But that's not a reason. That's just a habit. "You're right," I said. "That's not a sufficient justification. A thing being old doesn't make it correct." Felix blinked. Then, very carefully, he didn't like it when I said that. I imagine he didn't. People who rely on tradition as an argument usually find it destabilizing when someone questions it. I pulled one of the books from the pile. "Have you read anything about how knowledge actually works? Not what we know, but how we come to know things?" Felix straightened slightly in his chair. Edmund, by the window, had stopped pretending not to listen. "No," Felix said. "Do you want to?" The pause this time was shorter. "Yes," Felix said. I handed him the book. He took it with both hands, the way children handle things they've decided to take seriously. "We'll read the first chapter," I said. "And then you can tell me where you think he's wrong. Because there are probably places." Felix looked down at the book. Then up at me. Something in his face shifted. Not warmly, exactly. Felix Ashcroft was not a warm child. But it was a kind of recalibration. An adult had, apparently, said something true. "All right," he said. I didn't look at Edmund. I didn't need to. I could feel him watching, and I could feel the quality of his attention. We read for 2 hours. Felix was, as promised, smarter than the tutors. He was also, as I suspected, desperately in need of someone who would confirm that being smart was all right, that asking questions was all right, that not accepting inadequate answers was a feature, not a flaw. I left at 4 o'clock with a standing Friday arrangement, and the knowledge that I had just made myself significantly more entangled in the Ashcroft household than I had planned. My aunt was very pleased. For the wrong reasons. But still. Chapter 4. The question came on the third Friday, which was perhaps a week too early for my composure to be fully prepared. Felix had gone to find his book. He'd left it in the wrong room, which he did regularly and with total confidence that someone would produce it, and Edmund and I were briefly alone in the library for the first time, which should have felt significant, but mostly felt like I needed to be very careful about the next 4 minutes. "Can I ask you something?" Edmund said. "Of course," I said, with the calm of someone internally saying, "Please not about my feelings, please not about my feelings. Why are you doing this?" I looked at him. He was standing by the bookshelf. He often stood near bookshelves, which I found deeply unsurprising, and he had the expression he wore when he was thinking carefully. Not suspicious, just genuinely uncertain, which on Edmund Ashcroft was rare enough to be notable. "Doing what?" I asked carefully. "Coming here. Spending time with Felix." He paused. "You're very good with him. You don't have to be. You don't have any obligation to us." The honest answer was, "I am trying to prevent your brother from becoming a villain, and you from losing everything, because I love you in the way you love something you've only known from a distance, and I am hoping that proximity will make it real." The dishonest answer, and the one I gave, was, "I find him interesting." "That's not all of it," Edmund said. I looked at him steadily. "What makes you say that?" "Because you bring books," he said. "Specific books. Like you've thought about it. And you talk to him like he's a person worth taking seriously, which is..." He paused. "Most people don't. Most people are uncomfortable with him." "That's their limitation," I said, "not his." Edmund looked at me for a moment. Something in his expression went still in the way things go still when someone has just said something you've been thinking for a very long time. "Yes," he said. "It is." I had the very uncomfortable sensation of having connected a fact. Edmund Ashcroft had spent years defending his brother against a world that found Felix inconvenient, while probably also wondering, the way anyone wonders, whether the inconvenient parts were his fault somehow. And here I was, casually confirming his private belief, which was both true and strategically excellent, and also made me feel somewhat terrible about the strategy. "I had a difficult childhood," I said, which was not a lie. My previous life had been complicated in ways I rarely examined, and something about that connected to what I was saying. Someone took me seriously when I was young. It made a significant difference. Edmund was quiet for a moment. Then, "A teacher," I said, which was also true, in a way that applied to this world as much as my previous one. Someone who assumed I was capable before I proved it. Felix appeared in the doorway with his book and the announcement that he had found it, but it had been behind the wrong chair, and someone had moved it, which was not him, obviously. Edmund looked away from me. I exhaled. "We were about to start the second section," I said, with perfect composure. "Sit down, Felix, and tell me what you think happened at the end of chapter 7. Felix sat. He had an opinion. He always had an opinion. I didn't look at Edmund for the rest of the hour. But I was aware of him, the way you're aware of something that has shifted slightly and can't quite be shifted back. Chapter 5. The Hensley Garden Party was a standard social event for children of good families. Ribbon games, small sandwiches, adults making conversation at a careful distance while their offspring circulated. Felix had been brought along because he had requested to come, which was unusual enough that Edmund had agreed before examining the request too closely. I had not realized Felix had a plan. In fairness, neither had Felix. Not exactly. It had been more of an improvised escalation, the way his things tended to be. It started when he overheard Lord Hensley's eldest son explaining to a smaller child that certain families didn't sit at the top table at Parliament, because they weren't clever enough to be there. The smaller child in question was the daughter of a minor noble family that had apparently recently been involved in some parliamentary reorganization. The restructuring was genuinely political, And probably not about cleverness at all. Felix had opinions about this. He expressed them. He expressed them at length. To Lord Hensley's eldest son, who was 12, and did not appreciate being told, by a 7-year-old, that his explanation was factually incorrect and also a cover story for straightforward power consolidation, which was, quote, obvious. The 12-year-old said something unkind. Felix said 3 things unkind in return, each more precisely targeted than the last, because Felix had spent 2 weeks reading about rhetoric with me and had retained everything. By the time I reached them, I had been getting lemonade. I had been gone for 3 minutes. There was a circle of children and Felix was winning an argument with someone 5 years older than him while a significantly impressed 7-year-old girl watched from the sidelines. Felix, I said. He started it, Felix said. I know, I said. Which I did. You can be right and still not make it worse. Felix looked at the 12-year-old, then back at me. Something moved in his expression. The calculation I was learning to recognize. I said true things, he said. You said true things unkindly, I said. Which is a different skill than saying true things well. Felix blinked. There's a difference, I continued, between being correct and being persuasive. You want the second one. You're naturally good at the first. The second requires that the other person not feel attacked. The 12-year-old, apparently deciding discretion was the better part of valor, had retreated. The 7-year-old girl was still watching Felix with the focused attention of someone who has found something interesting. Felix looked at me for a long moment. So I should have been more diplomatic. Eventually, I said. You can learn it. He considered this. Then, with a 7-year-old's complete sincerity. Can you teach me? Behind me, I heard Edmund arrive. He'd come when someone told him there was an incident, which had probably been described as much more dramatic than it was. I didn't turn around. Yes, I said to Felix. That's something I can teach. The 7-year-old girl, whose name turned out to be Clara, then asked Felix if he wanted to play the ribbon game, and Felix, possibly for the first time in his life, said yes to something social without it being preceded by an argument. Edmund appeared at my elbow. What happened? He was right, I said. He was also somewhat unkind about it. We've had a conversation. You've been teaching him rhetoric. Epistemology mostly, I said. Rhetoric came up organically. Edmund looked at me sidelong. There was something in his expression that I was starting to recognize as his I have a feeling about this face, which he deployed rarely and never explained. He's different, Edmund said quietly. Since you started coming on Fridays. Hopefully in a good way. Yes, Edmund said. Definitely in a good way. A pause. He told me last week that you treat him like his opinions matter even when they're wrong. I thought about that. His opinions do matter. Even when they're wrong, the way he thinks is interesting. He said. Edmund continued, with the careful diction of someone quoting exactly, that you're the first adult who argues with him properly. I laughed. I couldn't help it. Edmund smiled, the real one, with his whole face. We watched Felix teach Clara the 7 things he'd observed about the ribbon game's structural design, and Clara listened to all of it with the patience of someone who had decided this person was worth listening to. She's going to be his friend, I said. Is she? She's not afraid of him, I said. Children who aren't afraid of him, he doesn't know what to do with them, and that makes him curious. Curiosity for Felix is basically affection. Edmund was quiet for a moment. You're very observant, he said. I've had practice, I said. Which was true. I had read about his brother extensively, in another life, in another world, in a book that had never thought to ask why Felix Ashcroft had become what he'd become. I was asking now. Chapter 6. You, said my aunt over breakfast, with the precision of a woman who has been waiting to say something for several days and has finally selected the moment, are spending a great deal of time at the Ashcroft residence. Yes, I said. I poured more tea. With Lord Edmund Ashcroft. And Felix, I said. Mostly Felix, technically. Technically, my aunt repeated. And Lord Edmund is always present. He lives there. My aunt set down her fork. She had the expression of someone who has raised several nieces and knows exactly what the words technically and mostly are doing in a sentence. Mira, she said with great patience. You have been brought to the capital for the social season. You have attended in 7 weeks, exactly 4 social events. You have not danced with anyone. You have had, as far as I can determine, exactly one flirtation, and it is with a man you pretend to visit for the purpose of tutoring his 7-year-old brother. It isn't pretend, I said. Felix is genuinely. I know Felix is a real child, my aunt said. I am suggesting that he is not the primary reason you go. I drank my tea. He sends you notes, my aunt continued. He's polite. He sent you flowers last week. It was one arrangement. Mira. My aunt leaned forward slightly. She was, I reflected, an extremely competent woman who had been significantly underused in the original novel. Lord Edmund Ashcroft is 30 years old. 28, I said, and immediately wished I hadn't. My aunt looked at me. He mentioned it, I said. In passing. He mentioned his age. It came up contextually. There was a long pause in which my aunt communicated, purely through expression, that she was fully aware of exactly what was happening and found my management of it both transparent and moderately adorable. He is, she said carefully, considered to be unsuitable by a number of families because of his brother's reputation. Felix is 7, I said. His reputation is still being formed. And his mother's family. His mother's family are, I stopped. I knew what his mother's family were. They were difficult, politically complicated, and linked to some financial irregularities that the novel had mentioned in one sentence and that were, in this world, probably already a quiet rumor in certain drawing rooms. His prospects, my aunt said not unkindly, are considered uncertain by many people. He's a good man, I said. My aunt smiled. It was a small, private smile, the kind that has been waiting in storage. He is, she said. I've heard as much from 3 separate sources, none of whom think it matters particularly. It matters to me. The words came out before I'd decided to say them. Simple, certain, true in a way that bypassed the planning and went somewhere more basic. My aunt looked at me for a moment. Something in her expression became gentler. Yes, she said. I can see that. She picked up her fork again. The subject was, apparently, considered handled. Just, she said after a moment. Don't let the child use you as cover indefinitely. He can arrange his own social encounters eventually. Felix, I said. Or Edmund. My aunt gave me a look that was equal parts fond and exasperated. Both, she said. Obviously. She was, I reflected, an excellent person who was wasted as a supporting character. I intended to make sure the novel version of events didn't replicate itself, which meant keeping her alive and preferably well past the 3rd act. One problem at a time. I finished my breakfast and went to write a note to Edmund about an article I'd found on observational learning in children that I thought he'd find interesting. My aunt watched me go with the expression of a woman who has at last stopped worrying about a particular niece. Chapter 7. The autumn parliamentary reception was the kind of event that the capital nobility attended, because not attending was its own kind of statement. My aunt attended because she sat on 2 advisory committees. I attended because my aunt attended, and also because I knew from the novel that this was approximately the point at which the political situation began to develop texture. Specifically, Edmund's mother's family was going to cause a scene. I did not know exactly which scene. The novel had been vague on specifics, noting only that the Carver family's interference in Lord Ashcroft's affairs had begun to escalate, which was the kind of sentence that told you something was happening without telling you what. I spotted Edmund across the room and noted, with some concern, that he was already talking to a man I identified by triangulation as Garrett Carver, his mother's cousin, and based on the set of Edmund's shoulders, a conversation he had not sought out and was not enjoying. Felix was not present. Felix was too young for parliamentary receptions. This was, in retrospect, the only mercy of the evening. I did what any reasonable person with a plan would do. I went and stood near enough to be visible without being intrusive, holding a glass of wine with the relaxed posture of someone who was absolutely not monitoring the situation. Your father's estate, Carver was saying, as I drew close enough to hear, will need significant management in the coming years. We've been discussing, as a family, whether some reorganization might be useful. Edmund's voice, when he replied, was very even. The estate is managed. Of course. But with Felix's situation, being what it is, there are certain parties who feel. Felix is 7, Edmund said. His situation is that he is 7. Carver smiled in the particular way of someone who doesn't think smiling means what other people think it means. He's a great deal of trouble for 7. I moved. I didn't plan to. Or rather, I planned it in approximately the half-second between hearing Garrett Carver's tone and arriving at Edmund's side. Lord Ashcroft, I said pleasantly. I was hoping to find you. I had a question about the Fletcher volume you mentioned. Do you have a moment? Edmund looked at me. Something in his expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of recalibration. Of course, he said. Carver, if you'll excuse me. Carver looked between us. His expression did the calculations of a man assessing a new variable. Lady Calloway, he said, with a smile that didn't reach anywhere useful. I don't believe we've met. We haven't, I agreed pleasantly. I'm Lady Alara's niece. I've been spending time with the Ashcroft family this season. I let a beat pass. Just long enough. Felix is extraordinary, isn't he? I expect great things from him. Carver did not expect that. He recovered quickly. He was practiced at recovering quickly, but there was a half-second where I could see him reassessing. Quite, he said. Edmund excused us. We moved away with the practiced ease of two people who have, apparently, done this before. We hadn't. But it felt like we had. You didn't have a question about the Fletcher volume, Edmund said quietly, once we were clear. I might, I said. Do you have any thoughts on Chapter 9? He looked at me for a moment. The reception moved around us, voices and candlelight and the ordinary politics of 100 people who all wanted something from each other. Thank you, he said. Quietly. Simply. He was being unpleasant, I said. He often is. A pause. He's been trying to get access to the estate management for 2 years. It's a long story. You don't have to tell me, I said. I know. He paused again. I want to. We stood near a window and Edmund told me, in the careful, measured way of someone who chooses their words because they've had to, about his mother's family. The inheritance questions, the political maneuvering, the way certain people had decided that Felix's temperament was a lever worth using. I listened. I knew most of it from the novel in the abstract. Hearing it from Edmund, in his own words, with the weight of someone who had been managing it alone for years, that was different. That was real. You need a lawyer who specializes in estate protections, I said when he'd finished. Not just management, actual legal barriers. I've heard the firm Aldred & Sons handles these cases. Edmund looked at me. My aunt mentioned them, I said, which was almost true. You've been thinking about this, he said. I think about a lot of things, I said. There was a pause. The candlelight moved. Mira, he said. It was the first time he'd used my name without the title. Just my name, the way you say something when you've been thinking it for a while. Yes, I said. He opened his mouth, closed it, looked away for a moment, and then back. Nothing, he said. It can wait. It couldn't. But I didn't push. Some things needed to arrive at their own pace. We stayed by the window for another hour, talking about books and estate law and Felix's recent interest in ornithology, and Garrett Carver did not approach again, which I considered a successful evening. Chapter 8. Do you like my brother? Felix asked. He said it on a Tuesday. I had started coming on Tuesdays as well, because Felix had developed an interest in natural science that required twice-weekly attention. And he said it the way he said most things, directly without preamble, as though he had been holding the question for some time and had now decided to release it. I put down the book. Yes, I said. Felix looked at me. How much? That's a complicated question. No, it isn't, Felix said. You either like someone a lot or a little. The scale, I said, is more of a spectrum than a binary, but for practical purposes, yes, I like him a great deal. Felix considered this with the focused seriousness he brought to all assessments. He likes you too, Felix said. He talks about you. In what way? I asked, with a composure I was very proud of. He mentioned you to his friend Harrow, Felix said. 3 times in one conversation. Adults usually only mention people that many times if they're important. I filed away that Felix had been listening to a conversation he was presumably not part of. This was consistent with everything I knew about him. That's very observant of you, I said. I pay attention, Felix said, with the simple certainty of someone for whom this is just a fact about themselves. Then, are you going to marry him? I blinked. That's rather direct, I said. You said direct questions are efficient. I said they were useful in certain contexts, I said. Not universally appropriate. Felix tilted his head. But are you? I looked at the 7-year-old villain in training who had, in the past 2 months, developed opinions about epistemology and bird taxonomy, and the rhetorical weaknesses of argument by tradition, who had made one friend, at a garden party, for possibly the first time, who had started saying good morning to the household staff unprompted, because I had mentioned, in passing, that people tend to be more cooperative with people who acknowledge them, who was under the calculation and the sharp edges and the difficult father and the complicated family, just a child trying to figure out how to be a person in a world that found him inconvenient. I would like to, I said honestly. That's as much as I can say right now. Felix thought about this for a moment. Then, with the pragmatism of someone for whom affection is mostly a problem-solving exercise. You should tell him, he said. He won't start things. He thinks people don't want him to. I looked at Felix. He's got a face, Felix continued, with the authority of someone who has lived in the same house as someone for their entire life. When he thinks something is too good to be real, he does it when things go well, like he's waiting for them to stop. I thought about Edmund Ashcroft, who had spent years defending his brother and managing a difficult inheritance, and being quietly competent in a world that preferred drama, who sent polite notes and one flower arrangement, and carefully didn't say things I could see him thinking. I know that face, I said quietly. Felix picked up his book. Then you know what to do about it, he said, with the definitiveness of someone closing a topic. Which was, I reflected, not wrong. For a 7-year-old with the emotional literacy of someone who has mostly observed people rather than connected with them, it was remarkably perceptive. Thank you, Felix, I said. I'm helping, he said, without looking up from his book. I've decided you're suitable. For your brother. For the household, he said. Generally. A pause. You can come on Thursdays too if you want. I managed not to smile too visibly. I'll consider it. That means yes, Felix said. He was unfortunately correct. Chapter 9. We were in the library. This was not unusual. The Ashcroft Townhouse Library had become, over the past 3 months, a place I knew well. The way the afternoon light came through the south window, which shelves Edmund reached for without looking, the chair Felix had claimed as specifically his and would not sit in any other. Felix was not present. Felix was at Clara's house for the afternoon. Their friendship had developed at a rate that I found genuinely moving and also slightly vindicating, which meant the library contained only me and Edmund and approximately 4,000 books, which was a sufficient quantity of witnesses. I was looking for a reference text on the upper shelves. Edmund was at the desk reviewing estate correspondence. This was normal. We had developed a comfortable capacity for being in the same room doing different things, which is, I think, one of the underrated markers of people who suit each other. I spoke to Aldred and Sons, Edmund said. About the estate protections? I asked from the latter. Yes. A pause. They were useful. Very specifically useful, in the ways you mentioned. I'm glad. The particular approach they suggested, Edmund continued, with the careful diction of someone working up to something, was something they said they'd recently advised another client on. They mentioned that a young woman had asked after their specialization. I paused on the ladder. Interesting, I said. Mira. I found the book. I came down the ladder. I set the book on the table and turned around. Edmund was watching me. He'd put down the correspondence. His expression was the one I'd come to think of as the careful one, when he was saying something he'd thought about for a while. You looked into it, he said, before you mentioned it to me. I did some research, I said. I thought it might be helpful. You thought, he stopped. Looked at me steadily. You've been thinking about my situation. Yes, I said, because there was no useful alternative. For a while, he said. Some while. I agreed. There was a quiet in the library that had a particular quality to it. Not uncomfortable, but charged, the way air feels before weather. Why? Edmund said. Not accusingly. Genuinely. Because I care what happens to you, I said. To you and to Felix. To Felix, he repeated. And to you, I said. Both. The order doesn't imply priority. Edmund was quiet for a moment. Something moved in his expression. The careful look shifting into something else, something less managed. I don't know what to do with you, he said, which sounded like it came from somewhere more honest than he usually let things come from. That's all right, I said. I have some thoughts on the subject if you'd like them. Something in his expression flickered. Almost a smile. Almost something more. Do you, he said. Yes, I said. But we can get to those. I pulled the reference text toward me. First, I found the chapter one was looking for. Edmund looked at me for another moment. Then he smiled. The real one, with his whole face, the one that still managed to surprise me slightly every time. Of course you did, he said. We didn't get to the thoughts that day. Or the next day. Some things, I had learned, moved at their own pace, and the correct thing was sometimes to prepare the ground and let the season do its work. But he had said I don't know what to do with you in a way that didn't sound like a problem. It sounded like someone discovering that they wanted to find out. That was, I thought, sufficient progress for a Tuesday. Chapter 10. The incident with the ambassador's son began, as most Felix incidents began, with someone underestimating him. Ambassador Roll's son, 13, confident in the way that boys who have always been in rooms where they were the most important child tend to be, said something at the winter social that dismissed Felix's observation about grain trade patterns with the kind of lazy condescension that Felix had zero tolerance for. He should, by now, have known better than to say it loudly. What followed was a 15-minute argument in which Felix, age 7, systematically and accurately demolished the older boy's position on 3 continents of economic policy, cited 2 sources, and then, and this was the part that was both impressive and a problem, turned to the small audience that had gathered and explained why the argument had been lazy in the first place. By the time I arrived, Felix had concluded his analysis. The ambassador's son was red-faced. 3 other children were staring at Felix with a mixture of awe and alarm. Clara, standing to the side, looked like she had experienced this before, and had learned to wait it out. Felix, I said. I was correct, he said immediately. I know, I said. Come here. He came with the slightly thunderous expression of someone who has won, but is being managed anyway. You were correct, I said quietly, once we were a few steps removed. You were also talking to an audience, not to him. Felix paused. The people watching, I said. You were explaining it to them, not trying to change his mind. He wasn't going to change his mind, Felix said. Probably not, I agreed. But there's a difference between winning an argument and winning the room. You won the room. That's actually more useful, politically speaking, but it also means he's going to be embarrassed, and embarrassed people make unreliable enemies. Felix looked at me with the expression he wore when I'd said something that required recalibration. I should have been less obvious about the audience, he said finally. Next time, I said. I'll practice. You'll also go apologize. Felix stiffened. Not for being right, I said. For the delivery. There's a version of what you said that would have gotten the same result, and left him with a way to exit gracefully. That's worth practicing too. Felix considered this. It was one of the things I'd come to appreciate about him. He didn't argue with principles, only with poor applications of them. Once a principle was established as sound, he integrated it. Fine, he said. But I'm not apologizing for the grain trade analysis. Absolutely not, I said. Edmund arrived beside me. He'd been across the room and had apparently tracked the gathering of people from there. What happened, he said. Felix won an argument with someone twice his age, and is now going to practice graceful de-escalation, I said. Edmund looked at Felix. Felix had already composed himself, and was heading toward the ambassador's son with the gait of someone who has decided to be diplomatic even though he doesn't want to be. He's going to apologize? Edmund said, with something between surprise and wonder in his voice. He's going to deliver a strategic non-apology that acknowledges the impact of the delivery without retracting the substance, I said. We've been working on it. There was a pause. Mira, Edmund said. Yes. You are, he said. Genuinely remarkable. He said it simply, matter-of-factly, the way you say something when you've been thinking it for a while, and have simply decided to stop not saying it. I looked at him. He was looking at me with the expression that wasn't quite any of his usual expressions. Not the polite one, not the careful one, not the almost smile one. Something more direct. Thank you, I said because I didn't trust myself to say anything more complicated. I mean it, he said. I know, I said. We watched Felix complete his graceful non-apology, and then return to Clara with the air of a general who has concluded successful negotiations. Dinner, Edmund said. Tomorrow. Not a social event. Just dinner. If you'd like. I looked at him. I would like that, I said. He nodded. The expression settled into something quieter and certain. Felix, from across the room, caught my eye. His expression was neutral, but I had learned to read Felix. He gave a microscopic nod. The 7-year-old was delighted with himself. I decided I was going to let him have this one. Chapter 11. The dinner was perfect for approximately 40 minutes, which was long enough for me to establish that Edmund Ashcroft cooked his own bread, had strong opinions about window placement in dining rooms, and had laughed, genuinely, 3 times before the soup was finished. Then Garrett Carver's letter arrived. A footman brought it on a silver tray with the apologetic air of someone who has been told to deliver unpleasant things promptly. Edmund looked at the name on the envelope. His expression went careful in the way it did when he was managing something. I apologize, he said. Read it, I said. I'll be here. He read it. I watched his face, not to be intrusive but because I needed to know what we were dealing with. The letter took 2 minutes. Edmund set it down without expression. He's made a formal complaint, Edmund said, to the Parliamentary Oversight Committee, about the estate management. A pause. He's suggesting that Felix's, he calls it instability, represents a risk to the estate's proper function, and that the family should therefore review whether I'm the appropriate manager. I looked at the letter from my side of the table. He's using Felix, I said. Yes. Specifically the incident at the Hensley party, Edmund said. And the thing with the ambassador's son. He's framing them as evidence of something hereditary. His voice was controlled. The implication is that any child who argues with adults that way is clearly brilliant and undertreated, I said. Edmund stopped. Felix, I said steadily, has an exceptional mind that has not, historically, been given appropriate direction. That's not instability. That's a resource management problem. And any parliamentary review that attempts to use that against him, or against you, is going to have to argue against documented evidence of a child making genuine intellectual progress under consistent guidance. Edmund looked at me. I've been keeping notes, I said, on Felix's development. Since the first Friday. Books read, concepts engaged with, social progress, rhetoric practice, the friendship with Clara. It's quite a detailed record. You've been keeping notes, Edmund said. I'm thorough, I said. Mira. His voice was quiet. Why do you have notes on my brother's development? I met his gaze. Because I knew someone might try to use him, I said. I wanted documentation that told a different story. The candlelight moved. Edmund was very still. You've been protecting him, he said. Since the beginning. Since I understood what he needed protection from, I said. Yes. Slowly, Edmund reached across the table and covered my hand with his. It was deliberate. Not impulsive. He was a person who did things after thinking about them, and this had clearly been thought about. You came to that ball, he said, and I thought, you were interesting. Very specifically interesting in a way I hadn't encountered. A pause. I didn't understand why, at first. I thought it was coincidence. But you knew things. About Felix. About the estate. About what I hadn't said yet. I kept very still. It's not magic, I said carefully. I just pay attention. To a remarkable degree, he said. To the things that matter, I said. His hand was warm. I had not anticipated, when I'd planned this whole enterprise in a carriage for months ago, how much I would come to want exactly this. Not the marriage, not the protection of the plot, just this. Just him, across a dinner table, telling me that I had been seen. I don't know what you're not telling me, Edmund said. I suspect there are things. There are, I said honestly, things that are difficult to explain. But you're not here to hurt us. No, I said. Simply and absolutely. Never that. He nodded, squeezed my hand once, then let it go. The letter, he said, collecting himself. What would you suggest? And we spent the next 2 hours writing a response that was polite, thorough, and would, by my estimation, leave Garrett Carver without a workable angle for the next several years. It was, by any measure, an excellent evening. Chapter 12. It was Felix who said it first, which I should have predicted because Felix said most things first. We were in the library on a Thursday. I now came on Thursdays as he had dictated, and he was halfway through a book on water systems engineering that he had selected himself, which I was encouraging because Felix's interests were specific, and I had long since stopped trying to predict where they would land. "Are you going to leave at the end of the season?" he asked. Not looking up from the book. The way he asked things he'd been thinking about for a while. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "My aunt goes back to her estate in March." A pause. "That's where you'd go?" "Presumably." Felix set the book on his knee. "Edmund would be," he said, with the specific pause of someone choosing words carefully, "different if you left." "Different how?" "He was different before," Felix said. "He was efficient. He did everything correctly. He just didn't do it as though it mattered." I thought about that. About a man who had been told, in a dozen quiet ways, that the things he cared about were inconveniences, that his brother was a liability, that the correct management of difficult circumstances was to be exactly as competent as necessary, and want nothing for yourself. "And now," I said. "He's better," Felix said, with the simplicity of a person for whom words like better and worse have practical meanings. "He talks at dinner. He laughed twice yesterday about something he read. He sent the Carver letter, and he didn't worry about it afterward." "That's partly the legal protections," I said. "It's partly you," Felix said, and went back to his book. I sat with that for a moment. "Felix," I said, "what would you think if I stayed?" He didn't look up, but something in his posture shifted. "I think," he said with the careful phrasing of someone conducting a negotiation, "that you're already part of the household functionally. Your absence would create an inefficiency." "That's a very diplomatic way to say you'd like me to stay." "I'm practicing diplomacy," he said. "You told me to." "I did," I said. "Also," he added, still not looking up, "you're the only person who argues with me properly. Clara tries, but she doesn't know enough yet. Edmund is too indulgent. You're appropriate." "High praise," I said. "It is," Felix said with complete sincerity. I looked at the 7-year-old who was not currently a villain, who had a friend named Clara and a rapidly expanding library, and an interest in water systems and a slowly developing capacity to disagree with people without making them feel annihilated, who still had the calculating look but was learning, slowly, to aim it at problems instead of people. "I'd like to stay," I said. Felix turned a page. "Good," he said. "Then you should tell Edmund before he makes a face about it." "He's making a face?" "He's been making a face for 3 weeks, Felix said. "It's very obvious. I don't know why adults think they're subtle." I laughed. I couldn't help it. Felix looked up briefly. The expression he gave me wasn't quite a smile. Felix didn't do uncomplicated smiles, but it was the expression of someone who has assessed a situation and found it satisfactory. "Thursday," he said. "You can bring the 2nd volume of the water systems book. We'll need it." "Of course," I said. We sat in the library in the afternoon light and read our respective books, and it felt like something settling into place. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the way things settle when they've been moving slowly toward where they belong. Chapter 13. The evening began with a walk, which was Edmund's idea and therefore suspect in the most pleasant way. Not the garden, the proper park, the long path along the river, with the early spring light doing what early spring light does when it's been coordinated by someone who understands aesthetics. Edmund offered his arm at the gate, which he did not always do, which meant he had decided about something. I took it. We walked. For a while we talked about nothing specific. A report he'd been reviewing, a book Felix had decided was insufficiently rigorous, the fact that Clara had apparently invited Felix to her family's estate for a week in summer and Felix had said yes, which was by any metric remarkable. "He's going to spend a week with someone else's family," Edmund said. "Voluntarily." "He likes Clara," I said. "She makes him feel like being difficult isn't the most interesting thing about him." "That's what you do," Edmund said. "I try to," I said. We walked a little further. The river moved alongside us. "I've been thinking," Edmund said. "About what?" "About what I want," he said. "Which is a thing I haven't spent much time on historically." I didn't say anything. I'd learned that Edmund needed space in the middle of sentences. "Felix told me," he said after a moment, "that you said you'd like to stay." "Felix told you?" "He mentioned it." In the way he mentions things that he's decided are important information that I'm failing to act on. He's been managing the situation, I said. He has, Edmund said. He also mentioned, and I'm quoting here, that my face has been obvious for 3 weeks and I should do something about it before it became an inefficiency. I pressed my lips together very hard. He used the word inefficiency, Edmund confirmed. He's very practical, I said. He is. Edmund stopped walking. We were near a bridge, old stone, the kind that had been there long enough to be reliable, and he turned toward me with the expression of someone who has thought about this a great deal, and has decided to simply say it. I would like you to stay, he said. Not as Felix's tutor. Not as a family associate. As he paused. As my wife if you're willing. I know that's significant. I know there are things you haven't told me. I know. I don't always understand how you knew the things you knew, or why you came to us with such specific attention from the beginning. A pause. But I know that you're here, and that Felix is different because of you, and that I am different because of you, and I know that I would like you to stay. I looked at Edmund Ashcroft. I had planned this. I had engineered the proximity, managed the timeline, positioned myself carefully from the moment I'd woken up on a university floor with a head full of somebody else's plot. I had been strategic and deliberate and entirely aware of what I was doing. And standing on this bridge with this man who was looking at me like I was something he'd been careful about hoping for. Yes, I said. Simply. Completely. He exhaled. Something in him settled. The same quality as Felix's library face. The thing that looked like recognition of something becoming certain. Yes, I repeated, because it seemed important to make it unambiguous. To staying. To everything you said. He covered my hands with both of his. Cold evening air, warm hands. I should have asked earlier, he said. You asked when you were ready, I said. Felix thought I should have asked in November. Felix is 7, I said. His timeline is aggressive. Edmund laughed. Fully with his whole face, on the bridge in the early spring evening. I had read about this man in another life, in a book that had not thought he was worth the attention. The book had been wrong. Can I ask, Edmund said, something personal? Yes, I said. The notes. The research. The Aldred and Sons recommendation. The books you brought the first Friday. He looked at me steadily. Did you know somehow that things were going to be difficult? For us. Specifically. I looked at him for a long moment. I had a feeling, I said, that you needed someone paying attention. Just a feeling. A very specific one, I said. He looked at me. He did not push. Edmund Ashcroft was, among his many qualities, a man who understood that some things arrived in their own time, and could be waited for. All right, he said. We walked back to the house. Felix was in the library. He looked up from his book when we came in, assessed the situation in approximately 4 seconds, and returned to reading. Thursday, he said to me, without looking up. Second volume of the Water Systems book. Thursday, I agreed. He turned a page. Edmund caught my eye and smiled. I thought, exactly where I needed to be. Chapter 14. The wedding was in June. Not the grand social event that my aunt had initially envisioned. She'd had a brief but enthusiastic period of planning that involved 3 venues and a guest list that contained people I'd never met, but something smaller, which Edmund had suggested and I had immediately agreed to, and my aunt had eventually accepted with the grace of someone who has realized that the battle she wants to fight is not the one in front of her. The guest list was 30 people. The garden of the Ashcroft estate, which was not in the capital but north, proper country, old trees, stone walls that had been standing long enough to have opinions about things. Felix was Edmund's witness. He had announced this, not been asked, and then spent 3 weeks interrogating the role's historical precedents to ensure he was executing it correctly. He wore his best jacket without complaint. He stood exactly where he was supposed to stand. He did not say anything during the ceremony that was not expected of him. He did, after the ceremony, produce a card that Clara had helped him make, in which he had written, in his careful precise handwriting, "You are now officially part of the household. This is efficient." Underneath, in different ink that was definitely Clara's handwriting, it also said, "And we are both very happy about it," with a small drawing of 2 people and a book. My aunt cried, briefly and with dignity, but she cried, and then she congratulated Edmund with the warmth of someone who has decided that a person is worth her complete approval, which he had, apparently, earned somewhere around the Carver letter. Edmund's friend Harrow gave a toast that was short, sincere, and included exactly one joke about the wine-stained jacket, which Edmund acknowledged with the expression of a man who has decided this is acceptable. Clara caught the flowers. I was pretty sure Felix had engineered this, possibly by calculating the trajectory, and I had decided not to ask. There was dancing. Felix danced with Clara. He was not, technically, good at dancing. He was, however, completely committed to executing it correctly, which was its own kind of success. Edmund and I danced slowly, and I thought about standing on a university floor with someone else's life flooding back through my memory, and how I had made a plan on a 4-day carriage ride, and how the plan had mostly worked except for the parts where it had been overtaken by something more real. "What are you thinking?" Edmund said quietly. "About how I got here." I said. "Complicated route?" "Very," I said. "But I think I was always going to end up here." He turned me gently in the dance. Over his shoulder I could see Felix sitting with Clara, apparently explaining something to her using his hands, and Clara nodding with the focused attention of someone who had decided Felix was worth listening to, which was exactly what Felix needed someone to decide. "He's all right," Edmund said, following my gaze. "He's been all right this year." "He's going to be fine," I said. Because I believed it, now, in a way I hadn't been completely certain about when I'd started. Felix had not become a villain. Felix had become a peculiar, difficult, brilliant child who had a friend and a brother who saw him in a library full of books. The plot, such as it was, had concluded differently than written. I thought sometimes about original Mira Calloway. 3 lines of dialogue, 2 mentions, 1 off-page death, a footnote, a body count, a character who existed to confirm that the world was dangerous, and then was gone. I had been her. I was still her, in some ways. The name, the face, the family. But I had also been a woman who had woken up on a university floor with her whole previous life evaporating and had decided, in the wreckage of that, to pay attention. To the man who helped old women across muddy courtyards. To the difficult child who needed someone to argue with him properly. To all the things the novel had not bothered to see. Paying attention had been, it turned out, sufficient. Rosalind reached up from my lap and grabbed a handful of my hair, which she found extremely satisfying. "Ow," I said. "Duh," said Rosalind, pointing at the door. Edmund came in carrying the letters and what appeared to be a small gift from Felix, who had sent it from his term at university with a note that read, "For Rosalind. First volume only. The second is too advanced." The gift was a children's natural history, the same series I'd recommended to Felix, 5 years ago, on a Saturday morning in a garden with a duck incident, and a brother's almost smile. I held it and felt something complete. "He remembered," Edmund said. "He always remembers things," I said. Edmund sat beside me. Rosalind immediately transferred her attention to him. Outside, the garden was summer green. Somewhere in the capital, Felix was arguing about philosophy with Clara, and they were both probably going to be fine. I was, I thought, the luckiest footnote in the history of narrative fiction. Which was not a sentence I had expected to be able to say. But here we were. Epilogue. 10 years after a woman tripped over her shoelaces and remembered a novel she'd read 17 times, the following things were true. Edmund Ashcroft was 48 and had been elected to a parliamentary oversight committee, which he managed with the same quiet competence he brought to everything. He still read history books for pleasure. He still laughed properly, with his whole face. He had, without making a show of it, become one of the more respected figures in their circles. Not because he was dramatic, but because he was reliable in ways that mattered when things went sideways. Rosalind was 9 years old, and had inherited precisely the qualities that made both her parents and her uncle simultaneously proud and occasionally exhausted. She could out-argue Felix on certain narrow subjects. He had told her this himself, with something that was not quite pride but was adjacent to it, and had recently informed her tutor that his interpretation of historical causation was philosophically shallow. I had expressed appropriate concern and then, when alone, been somewhat pleased. Felix was 22. He had completed his studies, argued with 4 professors on matters where he was correct, maintained his friendship with Clara through the entire period, and had, in his final year, co-authored a paper on institutional decision-making that cited approximately 30 sources, and had been described by the department chair as aggressively well-researched. He had also, in his capacity as an increasingly prominent young intellectual, caused one diplomatic incident, which was, he had published an analysis of trade agreements between three noble families that was factually accurate, meticulously sourced, and politically inconvenient for several powerful people who had been assuming the information was not being tracked by anyone. It was, all things considered, a mild diplomatic incident. No one had been assassinated. No estates had been destroyed. The powerful people had been embarrassed and had subsequently reorganized some of their practices, which was arguably the correct outcome. Felix had also, afterward, come to dinner and accepted my suggestion that the next paper's publication strategy might benefit from some advance preparation. He had listened. He had disagreed on two specific points. He had ultimately incorporated both pieces of advice. Clara was there for dinner. She was completing her own research and would, in about 2 years, publish something that would be significantly more disruptive than Felix's paper, in the best possible way. Felix already knew this and was, in his particular style of affection, furiously proud of her. My aunt chaired a parliamentary committee, and had written a book about advisory governance that had been cited in 14 separate papers, none of which were Felix's, which he found irritating. The Carver family had ceased to be a significant political presence. This had happened gradually, through a combination of the legal protections, Edmund's steadily growing reputation, and the publication of Felix's first paper, which had noted certain family practices in one particularly well-sourced footnote. The footnote had, Edmund said, been disproportionately effective. I asked Felix if the footnote had been intentional. "Everything I write is intentional," he said. "Including the footnote specifically." A pause. "The footnote," Felix said carefully, "reflected accurate information that was relevant to the analysis." Felix. "I had the information," he said. "It seemed a waste not to include it." I thought about a 7-year-old in a reluctant hat, telling me that adults didn't always do what they said. About a library on Tuesdays and Thursdays. About a child learning that being right was not the same thing as being effective. And then apparently deciding that in this particular case, footnote-level effectiveness was sufficient. "Fair enough," I said. Felix, 22, nodded with the composure of someone who had been vindicated. Rosalind said, "Uncle Felix, I have a question about your methodology." Felix said, "Yes." And they were off. Edmund caught my eye across the dinner table. He smiled, the real one. It still rearranged his whole face. I thought, not for the first time, about the other version of this. The novel version. The one where Edmund lost everything slowly, quietly, in a sequence of events that no one stopped because no one was watching. I had watched. I had paid attention, and argued with a difficult child, and tripped into a man at a ball and redirected, by the accumulated weight of Fridays and Tuesdays and specific book recommendations, and one well-timed legal consultation, the entire trajectory of two people's lives. It was not, strictly speaking, heroic. There had been no battles, no grand speeches, no dramatic confrontations where the villain was unmasked and defeated. There had been a duck incident, a non-apology at a children's party, a walk in a garden in winter, a dinner interrupted by a letter, a bridge in early spring, a wedding in June, a daughter who argued with her uncle about methodology, 10 years of Thursdays. I had been a footnote, and then I had not been. The novel had been wrong about a great many things. It was wrong about what made a person worth watching. It was wrong about which characters were just background, and which ones had stories worth telling. It was wrong about what caused a villain, and therefore wrong about what could prevent one. I had been right, in a borrowed life, in a story not originally mine. I was still here. That, I thought, was quite enough. And that's where this love story ends for now. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more romantic twists. Tell me in the comments what will you have done. Until the next story, keep craving romance.